Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So if you see my recent posts, I've been discussing many of the differences between Xperia 1 Mark V and the Mark 8s. But today is a little bit different. With me, I have the Oppo Find X9 Ultra and of course the 1 Mark 8. What I don't see online is YouTubers discussing the differences between these two phones and how well the Mark 8 stacks up to Oppo's latest and greatest. Obviously, everyone's focused on the big flagships, right? From Xiaomi, Vivo, Samsung, Google, Apple. But I really think that the Mark 8 deserves more love than it's getting, especially because, as you'll see, I think the Mark 8 holds up remarkably well to the Oppo X9 Ultra. So stick around and let's get to it. Jumping right into it, we're comparing the Xperia on the left-hand side to the Oppo on the right-hand side, using the main sensor on both devices. Now it should be noted that the shooting mode was set to basic on both, so on the Xperia it's full auto, and the Oppo it's a basic standard shooting mode, not master mode, so they will give similar vibes between both devices. The first thing you notice is that the Xperia's smaller main sensor is kind of reaching its limitation at this point. You can see here on my sweater that the black isn't exactly black. It's more like a bluish gray, probably because the image is slightly overexposed compared to the Oppo, which gives a much flatter look overall. And obviously the black here is actually black. That being said, I think that it's important to note that the Xperia overall, at least the Mark 8, tends to favor a punchier, more contrasty look compared to the Oppo. So that would explain why, for example, the floor here is slightly more orange than the floor in the Oppo. And it comes down to personal preference. Things like the dark shadow here can always be lifted if you want to make the image a little bit flatter, as it happened on the Oppo. But Sony again tends to leave shadows as shadows. It doesn't do aggressive HDR processing like the Oppo in order to fix or rein in dynamic range. You can kind of see that here in the window. And actually, obviously, the Oppo did much better here in this example compared to whatever Sony was doing over here. But from a distance, I don't think that there's a huge gap between the Xperia compared to the Oppo. I mean, physics is physics, so the larger sensor in the Oppo will win, quote unquote. But I don't think that I'd be unhappy with this photo on the Xperia after making a couple of tweaks to fix the white balance and the saturation. Moving on to the 70mm lens on both devices, I think that the Xperia did a much better job here than in the last comparison, and holds up pretty well to the Oppo. Again, the Xperia's philosophy is punchy, contrasty images, which is why on my face the shadow stays as a shadow, right? It's not lifted the way it is in the Oppo to a flatter look. Thankfully, in this case, the white balance on the Sony did recover the black of my sweater, and it's very similar to the Oppo. You can see here that's the leaves here that the color is very similar to across both devices, right? So there's some slight differences maybe in brightness or saturation, but nothing too crazy. Especially, you can also see here in the vase that the gold color matches very well across both devices. If we zoom in to my face, you'll see where the Xperia kind of falters a bit compared to the Oppo. Looking at the details in my hair, it is a little bit smudgier, a little blurrier compared to the Oppo, which which resolves the hair pretty well. But again, consider that the Oppo's 3 times zoom sensor is also larger than Xperia, which is why I can do this without having to do extra processing in order to make the hair look decent, right? But I would say that overall, considering the change or the differences in the sensor size, I don't think the Xperia is falling behind that much. And again, view from a distance. Oops. Let's go back. Sorry about that. The view from a distance. I'm not dissatisfied with the Xperia. I think both are great photos. I'd probably immediately go with Xperia if I wanted to post it, let's say on IG or something like that. Yes, the Oppo is a little bit more true to life because I got the exposure corrector here in my face. But in terms of a mood or maybe a vibe that I'd like to go for, I'd probably choose Xperia. And I don't think you go wrong with either device in this case. I'm happy to say that the Xperia did pretty well here, in my opinion. Looking with the 70mm lens, this is a test of the macro mode. In terms of color and saturation, the Xperia is slightly more exposed, not as saturated as the Oppo. And again, there's just a quick tweak in post can fix that if you think it's overexposed. What I'm more curious in is how the letters here, or the fall off rather, of blur across the letters. So this is where I think Sony has an advantage. If we zoom in on the letters, you can see that from left to right, it starts off in focus and then it gradually falls off, as you would expect, based on the angle of the pen. Whereas on the Oppo, it's blurry, gets sharp, then blurry again. And this is somewhat of a sharp fall off here, right? And the reason that happens is because even though a Pro having a bigger sensor is more likely to come in, on the Oppo having such a large zoom sensor and also a very wide aperture, or relatively wide aperture, means that the focal plane is very limited, right? So it's a very short distance that I could actually focus in. So any slight angling off of that focal plane will cause this sudden drop in or the sudden increase in blurriness. So yeah, I think this is a win for Sony in my opinion. If only because of the way the blur kind of falls off here from sharp to blurry. But you could always add more blur if you want, but here this is just pretty much set in stone. You can't necessarily remove blur unless you're using some sort of editor or some sort of post editing. So just the last comparison of the 70mm lens across both devices in the basic standard applications. No master mode, no pro photo mode or photo pro in the Xperia. The only thing I want to point out here is one is obviously this is a cutoff, which I'm not going to show my son's face, but I really wanted to point out one thing that I noticed with the Oppo that kind of surprised me. Now, in very harsh light, such as in this particular example where we're outside in the park, yes, the Xperia again shows that it's a little more saturated, slightly warmer compared to the Oppo, but the Oppo, when faced in really harsh conditions, lighting conditions, it does aggressive HDR processing, and you can clearly see that in my son's hand. I don't know what this is. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. But the Oppo really did not get this correct. There's like an outline here in the finger, all the way to the fingertip. And then also if you look at the elbow region, you can see this kind of green line where the colors are bleeding into each other and actually bleeding from the shirts into his skin. Whereas in the Sony, it's all well and good, right? So it's something to consider in terms of the standard processing algorithm in the Oppo. I'm personally not a fan of this crazy HDR look that many phones are doing nowadays to make the image flat. And this is a good example of why you don't want that, right? And many people say, "Oh, stick to master mode." But if you're going to do that, then you're only using half the phone, right? The Oppo has many features outside of master mode, and if you're forced to use master mode just to avoid this kind of scenario, then you're somewhat limited in the features that you can use of the device. So something to consider. Moving on to the outside, we're back to the main sensor on both phones. And again, from a distance, there's very, very little difference between these two images. Probably the biggest difference would be the way the sky is being handled on both phones. So the Apple did a better job of kind of not overexposing the sky as it did in the Xperia. But I don't think the Xperia here is unpleasant, right? The light is coming from the right hand side across to the left, and I still think it looks good, even if the sky is better controlled in the Oppo. Now, again, since the Oppo has a larger main sensor, just full-on detail is better in the Oppo, and you can tell if we zoom in very closely on the bricks of the building. Clearly, the Oppo has the advantage here, and you can actually see the density that's here is slightly better resolved than on Xperia. But I personally don't pixel peep to this extent, so just from a general view of the photos, I think they're both very usable, and the Xperia, I wouldn't say the Xperia loses in this example, right? I wouldn't care so much to really dig into the fine detail as to which is the better photo if I'm just taking a snap for social media. This does matter in the end if you want to print things, but again, if you're not cropping into the image, right, to, let's say if I want to, for a print, then I don't think people will notice the difference between these two images. So, good job, Sony. So here we are testing bokeh mode on a 70mm lens, and in case you're wondering why I'm not testing the Xperia against the 10 times zoom of the Oppo, it's because there's no need for comparison. The Xperia cannot compete at that level. It just doesn't have the hardware for that. So I'm sticking to the 70mm lens and 70mm lens for the comparison. So in this case, I wouldn't worry so much about the background being different in terms of the blurriness, because that's set within the software. This is a software blur, not natural blur, so you can change the sliders as you see fit. That's not really my concern. To the extent that you want to see how well the outline is managed, in this case it probably wouldn't make much difference on the sliding effect, because I have a hat on, right? So it's not like I have these wispy hairs that are flying about that need to get resolved by the processing algorithm to make sure that the blurring occurs correctly. But what I'm more focused on is how my face looks on bokeh mode between both devices. Now, the Oppo did get the white balance correct. I think that the Oppo has pleasing colors, and it's probably due because they have a dedicated white balance sensor on the back of the device, whereas Sony does not. So I do think that the Oppo does win in getting the white balance correct the first time. So with the Sony, you have to kind of maybe fiddle with it a little bit, either in the camera or in post. The white balance in the Oppo is more consistent in that regard. However, I do think that the exposure on the Oppo is probably not correct. It's a little overexposed, even if it does lead to I guess a more pleasing image. But the Sony is correct in terms of exposure. It was kind of already dusk and the sun was going down, so it was not this bright. but as in the Oppo. So it's give or take, and again, personal preference. But you know, I'm happy again with how the Sony is performing here. Um, Considering that the zoom lens is smaller, I think it definitely punches above its weight, and due to the fact that Sony is using multi-raw stacked processing to kind of reduce the amount of noise in the image. So even though the Oppo hardware wins on paper, I don't think it's that much of a win compared to the Sony. I think the Sony does really well here, and I'm happy with the original Sony photo, and I would totally be fine with that if that means having a more comfortable device to hold, because the Oppo is a heavy phone. I gotta tell you, when I first picked up the Oppo, I was like, whoa, it was immediately noticeable, and you kind of have to make that determination as to whether the extra hardware with the 10 times zoom or the more advanced sensors on the Oppo are worth the extra weight, because I can see that getting tiresome very quickly. So here we are back to the main sensor, and I wanted to highlight master mode. So the Oppo is in master mode, which is supposed to give you a rendition of a certain Hasselblad camera, which is famous for its color rendition, and that's what everyone is raving about when it comes to this device. Now, if you've noticed throughout this whole video, the Sony is consistently more saturated, more contrasty, to the point where sometimes that it doesn't get the scene correct in terms of what it actually looked like. You kind of have to pare back those settings in order to get a more natural look. And if you really wanted to, you can have the Xperia get its own quote-unquote master mode, because using the creative looks, you can adjust the saturation, the contrast, the brightness, and the warmth and the tint to match, let's say, the Oppo master mode, and that's what I did here. So the how to do that is that on the Xperia, I chose the neutral look, and then manually adjust the sliders to kind of adjust to so that the image matches more or less what I see on the Oppo, and I just save that as a preset. So I have a similar master mode look on my Xperia, and as you can see here, outside of maybe I expose this a little too much, the colors are very similar across both devices. And considering that the sensor is much smaller on the Xperia, the main sensor, I think it did a great job here, matching up to the Oppo. Interestingly, even on the smaller sensor, the shutter speed was slightly faster, 1/40 versus 1/36 on the Oppo. So, and it's actually slightly lower ISO as well. So that's pretty interesting. My guess is that Sony was using its nighttime mode in order to do multiple stacks of the imaging to reduce noise. But yeah, I think the Sony did really well here compared to the Oppo. I'm really happy with the colors, with just the general sharpness of the image. Obviously, the Oppo has better natural bokeh because the sensor is much larger, but other than that, it's pretty close in my opinion. Finally, this isn't a comparison, but I think it's a great example of how I can use a neutral look on the Xperia to kind of simulate mass mode on the Oppo. If you notice, this image is much less saturated and contrasty than any of the previous photos that I shared in this video, and I think it's really pleasing. If you take some time to pare back the contrast and saturation, you can get very flat images that also appear very mirrorless camera-like. And I think that's really the advantage of what Sony allows to when it comes to customization, right? So if I can zoom in here, this is I didn't mention it, but this is the 3 times zoom, and just the way that the colors are generated, it's really pleasing to me, and you can really get away with not always having to have punchy photos, right? Punchy photos don't always make a great picture, and sometimes paring it back, making it more subtle wins the day. So if you have an Xperia Mark VIII, I suggest you take the time to play with the creative looks and try to create a custom look that gives you a much more true to life photo that doesn't require you to have to shoot raw and then do all the edits in post. So there you have it. Let me know what you guys think. I'm curious if you agree with my assessments, and if not, please let me know in the comments. Thanks.